It's time for
On the Victory Homefront.
With Jamie. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of On the Victory Homefront. I'm your host, Jamie, and today I wanted to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, and that is food insecurity. And I'm sure you all know why I'm bringing up this current subject, because it is a real thing for a lot of families right now during our current situation here in our country. And so I thought maybe we could talk about it a little bit. We could learn what the greatest generation did in World War II to help fight hunger during wartime. The future is always uncertain, right? But there are ways that you can do to help yourself, to help your family, to help your neighbor. And so I thought this would be just a really important topic to discuss right now. And I do have some notes that I will be reading off of during World War II and what they did, even though I know what they did. It's nice to have my words all in one spot that I could just read to you. But I'm not doing this just it's because I am someone who suffers from food insecurity. I have suffered from food insecurities for a very long time, and it's gotten worse probably the past 5 years for sure. Since 2020, my fears of food insecurity have increased. I'm sure you can imagine why in 2020, but there was more reason to that. I actually got really sick. And not with what you thought, but it was an eye opener. And I wasn't able to get out of bed and help feed my family. And so my husband and my boys actually lived off of a lot of takeout, eating out. And that's not something that I was okay with. That if something were to happen to me or happen to our situation, how am I going to feed my family? Because to me, that falls on me very greatly because I'm the homemaker, I'm the mom, I'm the wife. That is something that's very important for me to do for my family. So to have the inability to feed my family, to physically get out of bed because I was in the hospital, I was having surgeries and treatment done for what I was going through. It really just threw my previous food insecurities, which I always kind of have had for various reasons throughout my life, and just threw me into full-fledged, I need to make sure I have food all the time. And it just made me learn more of ways to help make sure that I had food on the shelves. And I'm going to share that with you as well. But before I do, I want to dive in to what they would have done during the war years, because a lot of that is where I've got my inspiration from. And so I'm going to go ahead and read from my notes. And yes, so that's what we're going to do. Ooh, sorry about that. Okay. So if you watched my last episode, you know that we talked about in 1942, rationing started because we were thrown into World War II, right? With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, we joined the war the next day. And by spring of 1942, our government had implemented a rationing system. And what that was done for was to make sure and ensure that everybody in the country was fed, there was enough food to go around, and that the troops were getting fed. So, because the reason why it's not like all of a sudden our food disappeared, but our shipments went down and the need for food went up. Because not only were we coming off of the Great Depression to where families were still already struggling and they went through major hardships, and here we're going into a war, but we're just coming through winter, right? Not a lot of plants in the country were growing. A big part of the farmland was in winter mode. So not only did we not have the surplus of food going into war to feed troops, because they're going to need a lot of food and it's going to need to be saved or preserved a certain way for them to have it and to be able to travel light, but our shipments stopped coming in because the oceans were full of the enemy. And so we were not getting a lot of shipments coming in to help our country during the war years. And so to ensure we had enough food, the ration point system or stamps was implemented. Now, as I said in my last episode, one of the best things that could have happened about when the rationing came about is that it was springtime. And so it was ideal planting time. So something that the government systems really recommended to the citizens of the nation is to plant a victory garden. And so victory gardens popped up everywhere. And it wasn't a new idea. We did victory gardens during World War I. So a lot of the greatest generation was learning from their parents about victory gardens and planting and everything along those lines. But pamphlets went out, all the information went out. And of course, it was paper, right? They didn't have the World Wide Web, but information was going out how to plant your victory garden, where you could plant it, turn your yard into a victory garden. Parks were turned into victory gardens. Churches started victory gardens, rooftop victory gardens. And then if there was an empty field, you can bet the community came together and it was a big community victory garden. And each family would have their own little area, their own square footage that they were responsible for and that they could grow food for their family there. And then they could barter. If maybe someone did much better in carrots than the other person, they could barter something, or you could barter what you grow for some of the other short food items, such as eggs or milk or meat. You were able to do that. Bartering systems were, a big deal. And to this day, it's still something that we can implement, that we can bring forward. If someone has a surplus of something, you can barter with others to help you make more meals or to stretch your meals or to have more options for your families. So those were two of the ways that our country came together to help fight hunger during the war years. Now, there was more than just that. Beyond victory gardens and beyond the ration stamp system, families were recommended to have small barnyard animals. So literally in your yard, a lot of cities, a lot of towns relax their ordinances for families to have chickens or rabbits or goats. So yes, in town, your neighbor could have a couple chickens and a goat in their yard, hopefully not eating their victory garden, but to help get milk, to help have eggs. It was recommended 2 hens per family. And this was another way to help families combat hunger during the time of crisis. And it was very, very helpful. It was the U.S. Department of Agriculture that encouraged people to keep the small livestock in their yards. And in addition to ration stamps, in addition to the victory garden, and in addition to keeping small livestock, which I know a lot of us can't do anymore, there was a big propaganda system that went out that really encouraged people to can and preserve their harvests, to can and preserve anything that they were able to accommodate on their own to make their food last and to stretch their food. Because waste was the enemy. That's the number one thing. And I think as a nation, we've become very wasteful. And so they encourage people not to waste. That's a mouth not being fed. That's a meal for somebody else. Don't waste your food. Don't waste your harvest. And so there were canning centers that popped up in towns to help teach people how to can their food, how to dry their food, how to stretch their food. It was a whole national system, all these systems in place to help fight hunger. Because during the war years, food would be scarce. People would go hungry. It was going to be a fact. One of the programs that actually popped up that monitored the ration stamps, that monitored a lot of these things was the OPA. That is the Office of Price Administration. They were the ones in charge of rationing all the foods like the sugar, the meat, the butter, the coffee, and the canned goods. And then they also made sure they sent out pamphlets how to substitute. It was a whole national system. It was a whole national mindset to get these families fed, to get the troops fed. The troops got the best of everything, and they should have because they were on the war front. But here at home, we had our own home front going on to where we needed to make sure we were feeding the war workers. We were feeding the next generation. We were feeding everybody who was keeping the home fires running and keep the country running. It was vital. Some other things that came out were cookbooks. Cookbooks came out teaching people how to use things that maybe you wouldn't have used before, like chicken livers and some, other parts of the animal that you would normally have used. They became meals. Families learned how to not be wasteful by using bones to make broth, to use corn syrup or honey instead of sugar, to stretch meat with beans and oatmeal and breadcrumbs, right? Meatloaf. Those are just some of the examples. There were victory recipes. And if you were to pick up a World War II magazine, you will see constant articles of nutrition. People talk about nutrition. Oh, here, Philadelphia cream cheese. It will add to your dairy and your dietary needs. And this is how you can use it. And you can put it in your soup and make it go further. It was waste nothing. It was a major wartime slogan. People were told to plan meals carefully, use leftovers creatively, and compost scraps. Food is a weapon. Don't waste it. And then families would help their neighbors by sharing garden produce, trading canned goods, or volunteering at the USO kitchens, schools, and canning centers. Women's clubs and forage programs organized local drives for food conservation and education. Americans really turned a self-reliance into a patriotic movement. They combined gardening, food preservation, frugality, and community cooperation to fight hunger and to support the war. There were propaganda posters everywhere, with bold slogans such as Plant a Victory Garden and Food for Victory. Just there was images of families, children, and gardens making participation feel civilian friendly and patriotic. Now, something that they didn't have back then that we are lucky to have now is food pantries. They didn't have food pantries back then, but they did have ways to help families that still did not have enough food to feed their families for whatever their situation. And that was churches coming together. Churches would do soup kitchens, and the USO, the Salvation Army, also did it. And they would have like produce swaps where families, like I mentioned earlier, you could bring in all your extra heads of lettuce that you grew successfully and ask for eggs in, trade. So there were a lot of ways that were implemented into families, into mindsets to help keep our nation fed. And a lot of these unfortunately disappeared after World War II. I mean, thankfully we didn't need them, but that mindset of ways to help yourself, of ways to help your neighbor, unfortunately got pushed to the backside. And again, I'm grateful that we have food pantries now. It was this coming together as a nation to help our neighbors, to help each other, to help the effort of what everything was going on with the war. That is kind of what laid the base for these food pantries that we find ourselves in now. So I've been very lucky for the most part in my life, but I have had hard times. My family did rely on food stamps for a time. My family did rely on going to the food pantry. And I remember a Christmas where the Salvation Army brought us hats and mittens because we were going through some very difficult times when I was very young. And then there were other times when my children were young that we were financially struggling. And then again, when, I was sick. I was sick from 2020 through into 2023. And it really changed my mindset. And that's where I told myself there are things that I can do to ensure that whatever should happen, we're not going to go hungry. And I think that's something that we can take away from this greatest generation. There is so much information out there now on the World Wide Web, on different social media platforms, to where you can learn how to preserve food, what can be preserved, what meals are cheap. Everything is right at our fingertips on how we can help ourselves and our families to make sure that we don't go hungry. And then don't be afraid to reach out to your neighbors. I think that's something that we're learning now too. I'm seeing people come together, and it's a beautiful thing to help those that are currently dealing with food insecurity and not getting enough food on their plates. And we can all help each other as a nation. If you have extra, money, Buy a couple of extra boxes of macaroni and cheese or soup and drop it off at your food pantry. Volunteer at your food pantry. Check on your neighbors. Are your neighbors okay? There is a lot of pride, and people aren't going to ask for help. But if you know that maybe the family next to you is struggling a little bit and you're doing okay, and you know they're not going to take a handout, invite them over to dinner. Make extra. Send home leftovers, enough that they could have another meal the next day. I think that there are a lot of things that we could do to help each other out. And I'm not trying to come from an ignorant area because I am very grateful that we are doing okay, but I don't ever forget where I came from. I don't forget the hardships that my family had dealt with when I was young, when the boys were young. Yeah, so this is something that really touches me deeply. I really believe that together we can ensure that no one goes hungry and that the spirit of service and solidarity never fades. So, reach out to your neighbor right now, help out at the food pantry, buy a little extra, give what you can, and, let's help each other out. There are a lot of people out there that are willing to help. There are a lot of people out there that are willing to teach. I know I have done canning classes and dehydrating classes, and there are just ways that you can do it. And you don't need fancy equipment. There are ways to help yourself be more self sufficient. So let's all come together. Let's help each other out. And until next time, keep the victory spirit alive because victory is in the everyday.